Gadi, the stage is basically yours, but a second before, one second. Let me present you maybe, and then give you the remote control. So a couple of words about Gadi. If you're not familiar with Gadi Bashvitz, he is the CEO of Bright Security, and that's the company you're going to see the presentation right now. He's a highly effective executive with 20 plus years of experience holding product, marketing, customer success, and sales positions. With experience selling and partnering with an enterprise globally, he has founded, successfully grown, and sold multiple companies in various industries. He also started his career in cyber more than 25 years ago in the 8200 unit, which probably half of us are coming from the same one, and continued in various cybersecurity roles ever since. Gadi graduated from Tel Aviv University with a BA in Information System and Management, and from the NYU Stern School of Business with an MBA, magna cum laude. Respect, quite a respect. I mean, respect for being in NYU and then respect for the magna cum laude. And the MBA in general.
Thank you.
Well, okay, so let me give it the remote and let's see that it's working. Give it a try. Excellent.
All right. Perfect. So I'm going to skip around some of the slides because Tanya actually covered a bunch of the things, and there's no need in me wasting people's time. So I'll try to make it interactive and build on a lot of the things that that Tanya discussed. But what we're going to focus on today is really the next step, building on that presentation and talking about how do you communicate the return on investment that an organization can get from shifting application and API security left. We found that a lot of the organizations that have deployed AppSec solutions have focused on fear mongering and making sure that, oh, you'll be hacked if you don't deploy this, etc. I find it much more friendly to have a discussion around, look, this is the positive business impact that you're going to get if you deploy these solutions correctly, and if you deploy the correct solutions. And I have to admit thank you. I have to admit there are quite a few opportunities where we go in, we have a discussion with a prospect and we say, no, we're not the right solution for you. We don't want you to waste your time. We don't want you to waste our time. There are better solutions for what you're trying to achieve, and we'll actually recommend them to you. But if you are looking to shift application security left, if you are looking to find vulnerabilities in APIs and applications early, we'd love to talk to you because we can definitely help. And really, one of the key challenges that we're seeing with organizations today, depending on where you look at the stats, is that ever-increasing ratio between developers and AppSec professionals. We all know how hard it is to hire AppSec professionals and bring them into the organization. And if you're trying to pen test every application or trying to manually test these applications, especially in a world where development is accelerating constantly, that becomes an impossibility. You get to a situation where AppSec is overworked, doesn't have the right tools, and is not able to keep up with the challenges. And ultimately, that leaves you exposed because you can't cover all your applications. You can't cover all your APIs. You don't even know what all your applications and APIs are. And that means that you can't test them for vulnerabilities and definitely can't remediate those vulnerabilities. So in a world where that is a challenge, and augmented with the fact that organizations have deployed agile development, what we see is that development is actually running at this pace. And you can all see my finger moving very quickly, and AppSec is actually moving at this pace. And that creates a very, very big problem for the communication between the two, because until they are both running at the same pace and they are aligned and people have the right tools to do what they need, you will have friction between the two organizations. And that's just sad. It's for some reason, and I still don't understand why this happened, and hopefully we can break that. There is this perception that if something is a bug, then it needs to be fixed by development. But if it's a vulnerability, that's the problem of the AppSec team. When will we get to the point where we all acknowledge a vulnerability is a bug? It needs to be fixed by development. Development needs to understand it from the beginning and needs to have the right tools in order to remediate those issues early on, just like they're fixing bugs early on. Problem is that these are two different disciplines that are perceived differently. AppSec is still working in a world in many, many cases where they are used to long release cycles. That means that it takes us 3-4 days. Tanya mentioned examples of it takes 20 minutes or an hour or 2 hours to run as part of the pipeline. And that means that developers can't really use these tools because a lot of these tools were designed as tools for the AppSec team. What we have to do is we have to change this world and get to a world where AppSec provides the governance. Okay, we need to shift the approach where AppSec is the governance. They're the team that is providing the guidance and providing the tools on how to scan, what needs to be scanned, what needs to be remediated, what are the priorities, and how do we make it easy for developers to understand those priorities? And then the heavy lifting is actually done by developers. That doesn't mean that AppSec never scans. We'll talk about that in a second. That doesn't mean the AppSec doesn't use the tools. That doesn't mean that AppSec doesn't take all the information and make sure that that information is distilled correctly and communicated correctly up to management, etc. It just means that most of the heavy lifting and most of the actual work of finding the vulnerabilities and fixing them is done by developers. So AppSec can actually focus on the guidance, the communication, talking to senior executives, like we said earlier, and making sure that people actually understand the threat landscape. In order to achieve this, though, you have to have some very, very critical components. Tanya mentioned earlier that you need to have the right tools for developers to adopt them. And those components are, one, the tools have to be integrated. You can't have developers trying to do this manually. You can't have developers trying to feed in the information either about applications or about APIs manually. You need to be able to automatically detect what the attack surface is. You need to be able to trigger the scans automatically, and you need to adapt the tests that are running to the stage in the software development lifecycle so they make sense. Today, we can do this well in some environments, and some of my friends and customers who are on the webinar will tell you we're working very hard to do it correctly in other environments. All right, it's not perfect, but it's definitely a goal that we are trying to achieve. Okay. The next stage is really making sure that security is baked into your sprint planning. You want to make sure that you have the right amount of time and the right approach to make sure that security is not an afterthought. Okay, velocity has to be aligned. You have to get to a point where AppSec and development are running at the same pace and not running at separate paces. Okay. What AppSec's goal is really providing the remediation guidelines and making sure that you tell people what to scan for, hey, what to do once they find a vulnerability and what steps to take. Hopefully, the solution that you've implemented actually gives developers the guidance in developer speak regarding what they need to do and gives them the proof of vulnerability to make sure that they can understand it. If you provide a report to a developer and tell them, oh, this is CVE 574, they'll look at you like you're crazy, right? But if you tell them, hey, this is an SQL injection, here's proof of the fact that we were able to extract the headers of the table, and here's guidelines on how to remediate it, they will be very, very thankful. Okay, so you need to take the correct approach and think about who your target audience and provide them with the information they need. And what this enables is it enables the AppSec team to become a conduit to guiding and to communicating the information so our entire organization can get better. How does this actually look? And this is a real example from customers that have deployed it. Specifically in the DAST space, we focus on DAS, Dynamic Application Security Testing, or Dynamic API Security Testing, depending on how you look at it. And both are just as applicable, even though there's a lot of talk about API security today. But the idea is to test iteratively throughout the software development lifecycle. And we can see customers that are integrating, even though it's a DAS tool, directly into the IDE and can already run scans in the IDE or as part of unit tests to identify some vulnerabilities very, very early. Why is that critical? Because, as we mentioned earlier, it reduces the risk factor because you've eliminated the vulnerability much earlier than it getting into production. And B, you are able to fix it much, much faster. The developer is writing this right now, they're doing their unit tests, or they're running their code scans, and they find the vulnerability here. They are able to fix it within 10, 20, 30 minutes. If it gets to production, it will take 60x the amount of time to actually fix it. This makes the whole organization much more effective. Now, it's important to note that you can't find everything at this point, right? That only some of the vulnerabilities will appear here. For example, SQL injection will not appear at this point because there is no database connected. However, the earliest that you can find an SQL injection, for example, in the integration testing, that's where you should scan for it because you want to find vulnerabilities as early as you want. I'm showing 4 phases here. This can be 20 phases throughout the software development lifecycle, depending on your company, your organization, whether you have APIs or applications, what's the development environment. This can all come into play, but you need to make sure that you're optimizing the process and it aligns with your software development lifecycle. We've already talked about AppSec's role. There was one question earlier that I'd like to address, and that was the question of how do you know what to focus on or which vulnerabilities to focus on as you are running these scans and finding these vulnerabilities? Because if you're finding a lot of vulnerabilities and there's a lot of noise in the system, you don't know what to focus on. Shameless plug here. One of the advantages of DAST is that it does not provide false positives, which means if you did get a vulnerability provided by DAST and you did get proof of vulnerability for that, you know that it's a real vulnerability. From there, there are multiple steps that you can take to prioritize. And I'll talk about some of the integrations that we have in a second that really help with that. But the first one is there's external guidance, right? There's OWASP Top 10, there's OWASP API Top 10, there's Mitra 25. All of those exist, and they tell you what vulnerabilities are critical overall and which are not. The next level is really understanding the logic of your application. And here, what we enable people to do is say, you know what, yes, there is the OAuth Top 10. However, we know that this privilege escalation, even though it's not covered there, or these headers are a critical thing for these specific applications. And that means that AppSec, when they're setting up the environment for the developers, can decide to leverage specific templates that actually address the vulnerabilities that are most important for those specific applications or APIs. And I might be running scans for XSS and OSI and LFI at this stage for one application, but I might run completely different steps based on what the guidance is for my organization and what we know are the critical vulnerabilities. If you have the right tools that are configurable, and AppSec has the time to not just do the work like a hamster running around, but actually guide the work and guide the organization, they are able to define these things correctly per application, per API, and make sure that scans are run correctly. The other nugget I'll add is we have some very exciting integrations with some partners in the static analysis space, where we are able to validate the vulnerabilities that they found, because SAST finds a lot more vulnerabilities, but also has a lot more false positives. We're able to validate 2 things. One is tell you whether a vulnerability that was found by SAST actually exists in the production environment and give you proof of vulnerability. And the second one is tell you whether a vulnerability appears in a production branch or in a non-production branch. Both of those also help with prioritizing where to focus as you are running these scans. Now I'll go back to the beginning and talk about how do you actually measure ROI. And we're seeing multiple drivers. I've already talked about the fact that fixing a vulnerability early in the development lifecycle will take 60x less than fixing it in production. Okay? But there are many other ROI factors around this. The first one is we're seeing that still today, and tying back to Tanya's presentation and to the first slide that I started with, still today, even though we're investing a lot in application security, almost 90% of organizations are saying that they are knowingly releasing vulnerable applications and vulnerable APIs into production. This is knowingly. Okay? That means that they scanned. By the time they scanned, it was very late. They found a vulnerability and they said, we cannot wait. Our velocity for development has to continue. We have to deploy into production and we'll deal with this later. Right? That's terrible, but that's the situation we're in. Right? What we're seeing are organizations that have actually shifted left and were able to scan early, find vulnerabilities early, right? Are able to reduce that knowing or that knowledge to less than 50% of the cases. The other impact to that is that today it takes about 280 days in production to fix high critical or medium vulnerabilities. And that's more than 9 months in production. Why is that? It's exactly the issue that we talked about earlier. If I need to fix something in production, it's going to take me 2 weeks as a developer. I already have my next 10 sprints planned. Right? Where do I have a whole sprint that I can just stop and do the work? That just doesn't happen. Right? If I'm able to remediate a lot of the issues early, I can then reduce the amount of time it takes me to remediate vulnerabilities much more or very significantly in production. And the proof behind that is that we can find in those cases where we're implementing 10x more vulnerabilities early on than we would find them otherwise. This also helps to not just save time for developers, but significantly improve the relationship between AppSec and the developers, because now they have the ability to collaborate and work as one team instead of butting heads and having that antagonism that constantly happens. The antagonism doesn't just create frustration, it also means that that AppSec person that you hired that is 1 to 200 or 1 to 300 developers won't leave. And that makes you very, very happy because bringing on the new one or the next one is going to be very difficult. The bottom line is that if you do have a data breach, it's going to cost you the same. So you need to do everything that you can to reduce the probability of that data breach, okay, and make sure that your team is effective, efficient, and happy as you do that. I've already talked about the benefits, and I know I'm running out of time, so I'll leave you with this, but that was really looking at why should we shift AppSec left and what are the benefits and the ROI behind it. Happy to answer any questions that have come up throughout.
Excellent. So thank you very, very much, Gadi. There are a couple of questions. Let me start with this one. Question for Gadi. Whenever he gets to it, is there inherent resistance on developer side towards using AppSec testing solutions? And what's the best way to overcome it in your experience?
Yeah, so I think that historically, yes, there has been resistance, absolutely, because they received the wrong tools. Imagine that you're a developer and you are now told from your boss or from their boss, the CTO, okay, I'm expecting you to release every 3 hours, every 2 hours, every 1 hour to push to production. Right? But now I'm giving you an AppSec tool that will run for 2 days. And you're stuck because you can't release to production because that AppSec tool is going to run for 2 days or for 4 hours or for 10 hours. By the way, when it does run, it's going to give you a ton of vulnerabilities. You don't know which are real, which are false positives, right? And by the way, the guidance that you're going to get on how to remediate these issues is in AppSec speak, not in developer speak, so you don't know what to do with them, right? That creates antagonism with developers, right? And that's a problem. But if you come to them and you tell them, hey, I understand your problem. I understand that you have guidelines that you have to release in these factors. Guess what? The scans are going to take 2 minutes. They're not going to take an hour and a half. They're not going to find everything, right? But they're going to focus on XSSs, LFIs, OSIs, or whatever it is that is critical at that early stage. And they're just going to look at the deltas in the code that you, or the application or the API that you submitted, and help you find those vulnerabilities quickly and remediate them quickly. It's a completely different discussion. The other side of it is what I mentioned earlier regarding looking at their actual time spent and telling them, hey, if you actually fix these early, you will have more time with your family. You won't be having fire drills later to say, oh, I need to now spend a week or my entire weekend fixing this vulnerability that was released 7 months ago, and I don't even remember what part of the code it's related to. And that's something that people can connect to and understand.
Okay, another question. There was another question similar to this one, how to basically convince developers to. So it's their best interest to use such tools, but again, you already explained it quite thoroughly now. What are some of the metrics an AppSec leader can use to showcase to their CISO or the chief left is working?
Yeah, I think if we go back to that ROI slide, but one of the reports that I'm really trying to get in our system, but we don't have yet, but we will have soon, is showing the actual return on investment from shifting left. If we were able to show, here's an application or an API that we scanned, we found 26 vulnerabilities throughout the lifecycle. Of those 26, we were able to identify 13 at the unit testing phase or at the IDE phase. And that means that we were able to save your developers this much time in remediating these issues later. And another 10 were found in the integration testing phase, which means we reduced your risk by this amount. That's really the ROI that you're looking for. So you're looking at time saved across the organization. You're looking at risk reduction across the organization, and the fact that you have much better alignment between the teams, and it all ties into these factors that I'm showing here.
And I assume it's the same thing with the R&D team, so with the R&D leadership.
Absolutely. And we have, by the way, we have ROI calculators. So if you want to talk to me, feel free to reach out. It's Gadi@brightsec.com. I think we have the contact details later. I'm happy to share ROI calculators and go through this with you.
Excellent. Another question, and that's like a terminology question maybe. Is shift left testing applicable more to SAST or DAST?
Yes, it's applicable for both. By definition, for static analysis, it has to be shifted left because it integrates into the code. The big change that we are trying to drive is we say that DAST can be done as shift left as well. And it's not just shift left in terms of terminology of, I will have the AppSec team run these scans as part of the CI/CD. No, it's real shift left where developers become the users. And that's a critical differentiator. And it absolutely applies to organizations.
So you are speaking about running DAST, again, in the IDE or in an environment that is connected to the IDE. So you see it while you test it even before QA as a developer.
Absolutely, yes.
Excellent. And one more question, maybe the last one for now. Could you please expand on the use of the OWASP application security verification standard, the ASVS security framework, in regulated sectors like banking, financial services, insurance, and government, and the use of RASP, the runtime application self-protection, as a silver bullet-ish to solve our problems in production and the sense of security it generates?
So I'll start with the second one, actually. I think there's a word that you need to add to what you said, which is the false sense of security that it generates.
That's why I said
yes. There's a very famous saying in English that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. RASP, firewalls, etc., are the pound of cure. They are not hermetically protecting your organization. We all know, or those of us who have been doing this for a long time, that there is no such thing as a firewall or a RASP that will stop a real hacker that really wants to get into your organization. You need to prevent the problems from being there in the first place. You can't just mask them. Are these solutions good, and do they help organizations if there are vulnerabilities? Yes, they absolutely do, but they are not the be-all, and you have to try to resolve the vulnerabilities in the first place. Regarding the using the standards, I think it depends on the organization. Right? There are different organizations adopt different standards that guide what they need to do. And depending on the standards that your organization needs to adopt or is mandated to adopt, you can prioritize your vulnerability, so your focus and what you're scanning for and what you're finding accordingly. The tools that you adopt need to give you the flexibility that to do that, and that's what we strive to do.
Okay, excellent. Two more comments, in this case, my comments specifically in the first or second slide. It's funny, you basically show that according to the BSIMM, you have one architect per every 159 developers. Now, just for everyone to know, it's not a good statistic by all means, because it doesn't mean that once you have the first developer, you also have the first architect. Sometimes only when you have the 159th developer, only then you hire a security architect. So it can be that bad. That was one thing. And you mentioned also that why bugs are still considered or are considered developers' responsibility, while security issues are not. And thankfully, or not thankfully, it really depends on the point of view, I assume, the EU, same as the GDPR, they are now considering a regulation that will basically throw the responsibility on the developers for security issues in code, which is interesting. Again, maybe you won't like it later on, but for the time being, it sounds promising, at least conceptually.